right, I think we're going to go ahead and get started here. Thank you all for being here. We're going to actually drill in a little bit on assessing performance. So Peter and Carla gave us an excellent segue from the last session, talking about competency-based education. And I'm just kidding. It's actually Paul and Charla. They call each other the wrong names in the last session. So, but we're gonna segue straight from competency-based education and really hone in on mastery, right? So how do you measure mastery? How do you assess performance? So you heard Paul in the last session talk about things like, when is it okay for a learner to slide by, right, and not be able to land the plane, or a surgeon not be able to close, right? We don't want that. So when we talk about measuring mastery, what does that look like? So I have joining me with the panel, on our panel today, I'm Tiffany Fries with the Competency-Based Education Network. We have Josh Beutler with GoReact, Laurie Dodge with University of Massachusetts Global, Mark Atkinson with Mursion, and Gavin Cooney with Learnosity. And so they are all our technology tools or tool sets that we use to measure mastery and performance. So how do you measure mastery? So often we hear, and they talked about this in the last session as well, that we're limited by our technology, right? It's like we know we need to measure performance at a certain level of learning. We want to measure performance, but how do we do that? And we often hear statements like, well, our LMS offers these native tools. So what do we do with that? We can only offer true, false, or multiple choice. I don't know how to measure that level of learning, even though I want to. And so how do we make that happen? So today we're going to be talking about how to make that happen and how we can use technology tools to power those different types of assessments at the different levels of learning. So before we get started, though, we do want to kind of set a foundation for what we mean when we talk about competency-based education and what it looks like with assessment. So you heard Charla in the last session reference CBEN's quality framework. That's actually a tool you can find at CBENetwork.org. And it is a resource that was released in 2017 by a lot of the leading thinkers in the field, and they put together 8 elements of quality that indicate quality in a CBE program. Element number 4 is actually specifically about assessment and assessment practices. So when we talk about assessment in element 4, we're talking about the focus on several different characteristics, right? And you're going to hear a lot of these buzzwords today, and you actually heard them coming out of the last session. So I'm actually going to go over the description of element 4. It is described as authentic assessments, meaning it mirrors the real world, right? You heard Paul say that. It mirrors the real world, whether that be the workplace or real life in general. And their corresponding rubrics, which are key components of CBE, which is anchored by the belief that progress toward a credential should be determined by what learners know and are able to do. The overarching assessment strategy is comprised of assessment designed both to inform the learning journey, often referred to as assessment for learning or that formative assessment, that teaching and feedback tool, right? That benchmarking progress, that continuous improvement data we get from that. Validate mastery, often referred to as that assessment of learning or that summative assessment, the evaluative part of that. And in CBE models, assessments are intentionally aligned to competencies and cognitive levels. So with that, we're talking about using a range of assessment types and strategies or modalities to measure the transfer of learning and mastery into varied context. So authentic assessment design and use follows best practices for assessment professionals. So today we're going to really talk about 2 kind of overarching questions. How do we use ed tech to power successful implementation of quality CBE assessment strategies? How do we make it work, right? What does it look like? And how do we measure mastery of identified competencies with validity and reliability? So in saying that, we're going to turn it over and really start with, we have Laurie from University of Massachusetts Global. And Laurie, when you've led many CBE programs for years and have developed many assessments in your career. So how would you define mastery in CBE programs?
So thank you, Tiffany. At our university, we have 4 direct assessment programs, and I was part of the team that helped build those. So when I think about demonstration of mastery, I think about looking at those 3 students. You look at this one, got it, yes. You look at this one, you're like, yeah, no, they don't have it. And then you look, maybe it's emerging. So how do you know? So assessment has to be observable, measurable, and something that you can actually write down and track. So an example of that is in competency-based education, the weight of that program is really on the summative assessment. So that summative assessment is the assessment at the end, as Tiffany said, the authentic assessment, which represents something that you're going to use in the job or in the discipline. And most of those are, not all, but many are performance-based. So that would be something like a project, a presentation, a paper. Then a rubric is applied to that. And that rubric will determine mastery. It's the faculty that, go up to the table and look at the various criterion. The criterion have to align to that overarching competency statement, and then assessed. So that's how, and it's hard work, trust me. Assessment is really hard. But if it's done right, it's defensible because, in competency-based education, if a student masters or does not master, that's the line in the sand that allows them to progress to the next step. So it's really important to get it right.
Yes, absolutely. And Laurie made a few comments there about observation and observing performance. And then the flip side of that, then from an assessor's point of view, right, is like, well, then how do you score that? So I've implemented a program before where we actually recorded behavioral data, wrote every nonverbal and verbal behavior that was demonstrated by that learner, and then how do you scale that, right? So leading into Josh, so Josh, if you wanted to kind of introduce GoReact as a tool or a tool set, and then how does your organization enable competency assessment?
Yeah, thank you, Tiffany. I would have to say, if you thought of GoReact as a tool set, it's something that you would think of. We're very clear in what we're not primarily. We're not trying to be an LMS. We're not trying to manage a bunch of different learning experiences. It's much more a tool set that allows anywhere a learner should demonstrate a certain skill, anywhere they should be more self-aware of what they're doing, maybe interact with a peer or even an instructor on a formative basis. That's what we do in a way that is basically any combination of video capture combined with feedback or assessment or even summative assessment when needed. Now, the beautiful thing that happens is when someone becomes aware of themselves for the first time, it's awkward, right? It's awkward first, and then they start thinking, wow, I've got a lot of work to do, and the assessment can be any combination of those factors. But the key things we do, I mean, we've been around for 10 years, over 25 million presenter videos that have been presented on our platform, 800 colleges and universities, large and small, but it doesn't matter until it really comes down to that individual learner saying, wow, there's no better experience than I've had than seeing myself on video, which is awkward at first, and then getting feedback or being assessed or getting guidance that's in perfect context to act. And if I can do that as a learner, that's where my learning becomes real. And that's where it's a perfect alignment with competency-based assessment, because for that purpose, there is the time constraint melts away. It is, no, I've got it. I know how to do this. And when I'm assessed by it, it's so simple that everything is always interoperable. The learner, the instructor, even the assessor accesses the experience with no training. It just works.
So I love what you said there about how it can be awkward. So we are often asked, well, what if you get pushback? Well, you have those predetermined criteria, like Laurie said in your rubric, right? But then how do you argue with your own behavior? When a learner is able to see themselves behave and they're able to receive that feedback based on that, or even their results if it's a summative assessment, it's tough to argue with your own behavior when there's a set of predetermined criteria. Something Laurie had said earlier as well was, talking about the authenticity or authentic assessments, that real world, mirrors the real world. So leading into Mark, Mursion is often known as a practice and assessment platform, and being able to really drop that learner into real world situations. So if you want to talk a little bit about that, Mark, and how Mursion uses a blend of human and artificial intelligence. And then really, how does your organization power competency-based assessment in both the educational and corporate spaces?
So first, thank you for having us. I would start for all of you that haven't seen the work that CBEN has done. It starts with really good frameworks. Like the intellectual work to do what we do begins with folks that think through what performance really looks like on a sort of scale of good to great. So that's the work that we don't do. The work we do is design what we call experiential reality simulations that are a blend of AI and real human performance that create the authenticity, we call it sort of situational plausibility, around a challenging performance task. So we work mostly on the sort of soft skills side of learning. So in healthcare education, the sort of bedside manner of doctors and nurses. In education, K-12 and higher ed, it's much more about the intersection of pedagogy with behavior and learning differences. How do I differentiate in the classroom? How do I actually manifest inclusive practices? And the lion's share of our work is around corporate leadership. We do a lot in workforce development, a lot around diversity, equity, and inclusion, and leadership development, sales, and customer service. So it's one thing to know something, and it's another thing to be able to do it. I can sometimes demonstrate I can do it by filming myself or writing a sort of project, but the hardest order thing is to do it when I'm challenged or under stress. And simulation creates the real world situation where you have to tap the knowledge, actually manifest the behavior, and remain in control of yourself as you do it. So we've had the pleasure of working with both CBEN and their sister organization Quilts on sort of competency-based education in education and also in the healthcare space. I think simulation holds an enormous amount of promise to both be an assessment, where it then needs to be scored in some of the systems that you will see represented in the table. We don't do the scoring part ourselves. We provide formative analytics and video that can then be judged by humans or AI systems increasingly today, or practice, because so much of what's missing in the learning stack is the ability to practice a competency under stress.
Thank you, Mark. One thing to point out there, just from behavioral sciences, my background, and what really stands out with Mursion, specifically for me, is the real-time piece of that. It's all happening in real time, which is very important. It's not a predetermined artificial intelligence or anything like that. So leading into that, I think Mark made a great point about it's about the formative experience, the development of a competency, and then the evaluative experience, the summative portion of that competency. So do they have the competency? Yes or no, right? Have they mastered that? But then how do you get them there, which Laurie was talking about a little bit earlier. So I wanted to lead into to Gavin with Learnosity and talk a little bit about what led you to create Learnosity, and in what ways does your organization enable authentic assessment?
Thanks for having us, by the way. So, look, I started in ed tech 20 years ago last month. I got a 2-day contract with the Department of Education in Australia. I'm obviously not Australian, you'll get the accent. But I found myself in Sydney, and I got a job there. And I was immediately kind of appalled by the bad technology that there was in ed tech. You take a doctor out of a hospital from 100 years ago, you put him in a hospital today, doesn't know where he is, what these machines do, what these drugs are. Take a teacher out of a school from 100 years ago, put him in a classroom today, it's kind of chalk and talk, and it kind of annoyed me like straight away, and I wanted to do something about that. So what led me to create Learnosity was that kind of just that reaction to EdTech and, well, the lack of technology in education and the lack of investment, and we wanted to kind of try and raise the bar there. And I have a certain set of skills, and I could try to, like Liam Neeson, I could try to provide that technology to as wide as possible. And we kind of came across this idea that we'd power other people's products, and we do the great technology and give it to other companies and go from there. So we reckoned we could power other people's products and reach as many students as possible and improve things. And, it's done well. We've got about 40 million users across our different customers, and nobody knows who we are, which is kind of a great thing. But how we kind of power authentic assessment is we're a technology play, and what we're trying to do is we're trying to enable whomever we're working with, a publisher, a testing company, whoever it is, to build whatever they want to build from a pedagogy point of view. We're just a technology play that allows them to do that. So we introduced the idea of having many, many different question types, lowering the bar for entry for authoring to allow any teacher, any kind of subject matter expert, do kind of more complex question types, have better reporting, that sort of stuff, and then make it more accessible and make it more scalable, and then try to give that to the whole industry and let the whole industry rise with the tide of the innovation we were doing. So we kind of pride ourselves of not having an opinion on certain things around pedagogy or assessment or learning and so on. But really what we're doing is we're providing the raw building blocks to allow somebody build something kind of innovative in that space. And that we've made a massive impact in that way.
Thank you, Gavin. A few conversations with Gavin, I've heard the key word wide or range of assessment strategies come up. And as you all know who are familiar with the quality framework or the hallmark practices and CBE assessment, a range of assessment types really hallmarks CBE. And Laurie's going to talk about that a little bit, but that goes back to, it ties straight back to the formative and summative experience, right? So not only the performance-based assessment, authentic assessment, but then again, how are we going to build the learner to performance? And we need a range of assessment types in order to do that. So Laurie, I wanted to come back to you for a minute. If you could provide an example of how an institution would develop and measure mastery of a competency.
Sure. So I think it's easier just to think of an example. But first, from a show of hands, how many folks are from K-12? Okay. And higher ed? Good. And technology solutions? Okay, so wonderful. Well, first I want to thank the K-12 folks for giving us backward design. So backward design is the way that competency-based education programs are developed. It is, if you were in the last session, you heard Paul LeBlanc talk about how we used to teach and how I used to teach, where you'd be, you have your textbook, you teach merrily along the way, and you're like, oh my gosh, I have to make a test, right? And then you teach a little more in the book, and then you give a test. Well, backward design and how competency-based programs are is you develop your overarching competency statement or outcome, and then you determine the assessment as the next piece. So how do you know that the student has mastery? I'm going to give an example of performance-based, but please note, there are really good objective-based, but that's an art. To write really good objective-based assessments. There's also, at our program, we accept standard, certification exams that align to a competency, especially in the area of IT. So there are different types of assessment. But the example I'll provide is in one of our competency-based education, our bachelor's program, is you have to be able to develop and present a business plan. Well, a business plan, as I'm told, I'm a psychology major, so forgive me, but there's 10 parts. And so throughout the competency-based program, you are learning, the learning is scaffold, so different competencies, you're learning different parts of that. At that end, you have to not only have this plan, but present it via PowerPoint, speech, something. The assessment of that would be, as Tiffany said, would be in a rubric that would have all of the criterion listed in order for that student to have mastery. Now, mostly in competency-based education programs, if you have a rubric, you can't have an average of an 80% or a 70%. You actually have to have mastery in every criterion. So if it's a 4 level and say row 3 means proficient, you have to be in a row 3 for every piece, or you have to just keep submitting and trying until you're able to master that. So I think that's the part that's different. The educational journey part is really where the formative assessment comes in. So now you have your assessment, you have your tool, you're doing backward design, everything's super cool, and now you have to do your educational journey. So what are the activities that the student is going to be engaged in? What are they going to read, do, think about? And your formative assessment are almost like little mini activities or assessments that build towards student success at that summative level. So that's the secret sauce, now you know.
Yes, thank you, Laurie. We often, again, get the question of, well, what about that high-stakes summative assessment? Well, in CBE, it's not, right? Because you have all of those formative assessments sprinkled along the learning journey. It's a data point. You know where your learners are, their present level of performance at all of those benchmarks, and you're able to fill in any learning gaps that might grow. So that doesn't become a high-stakes assessment in the end because you know where your learners are. Gavin, how does Learnosity power a range of assessment strategies, including those feedback opportunities that are so important that Laurie has been talking about? How is all of that used to develop and measure mastery of the competency?
Well, the way we approach it, we seem that every single person we spoke to had built an assessment engine. And it's probably, the show of hands here who built an assessment engine. And a lot of people have done it more than once. And there seems to be hundreds of them, and or thousands, really. And what we wanted to do was provide those kind of building blocks to allow people kind of tackle those things. So we started with question types and interaction types. So, you know, we went to, say, a bunch of math publishers. We had a lot of math question types or auto scoring. Now, last year we did something like 1.5 billion math questions, auto-scored math questions. And we're able to do kind of more authentic questions by doing that. It's huge increase in video and audio and so on. So we provided those pieces, and then the idea was we took the feedback things and we allowed our customers build out their own rubrics as well. So if they wanted to have a teacher or grader or whatever give kind of audio feedback or video feedback or text or Likert scale or whatever it is, you're able to do that. So we provided these kind of building blocks to allow much more rich interaction types for students and much more rich feedback types for a grader or teacher, whoever happens to be doing that. And you know, and then you kind of, the idea is you're kind of merging the idea, like assessment used to be something that you did at the end of the semester, at the end of the year, and these 3-hour-long written assessments, I did 56 of them or something in university. If you put me in an assessment right now for 3 hours and armed with a biro pen, my hand would fall off. I would not be able to do it. And the idea was to kind of start bringing in the formative assessment piece to allow assessment to be done kind of on a daily basis. And kind of merge that into the learning experience. So what we were able to do then is put assessment into learning. It's not separate, you learn here, you get assessed here, but kind of blur that line a little bit and put a little bit of assessment along the way. Little end of chapter, end of the page, do you understand this thing? Little interactive as you go through a learning experience. And all those things, the kind of introduction of formative, the better feedback, the better question types, before we even get to kind of get the data out and so on, it sort of enables better assessment and more authentic assessment, enables the kind of you know, all these topics here we're talking about, assessing mastery properly, rather than just multiple choice. Because without somebody like us, the temptation is to go back to multiple choice because it's easy to do, and you know, we just kind of get it done and off you go, and we enable the kind of the bar to be raised a little bit.
Absolutely. So assessment not only, again, measures mastery, but becomes such an important part of that learner's experience with growth feedback and safe practice opportunities. Josh, thinking about formative assessment in that way as part of the development of competencies that leads to mastery, in what ways does your technology or GoReact offer safe practice and formative assessment opportunities with growth feedback?
There's so many ways it can be used. What we try to do is approach with the users and the programs that use this technology is fairly simple. I keep thinking about an experience I had a few years ago, a large program, not competency-based, but large, and the early conversations were very excited. They were excited about being able to do some of the things that we do. And then when we started talking about what is the why, like what are we trying to get at here? And someone high up in the team kind of said under their breath, they said, well, we have a lot of students that we work with, and we have had too many scenarios where we've had people move on from our program. And we have public partnerships, we have private partnerships, we have businesses that we place our graduates, and we've had too many times where the businesses come back and said, do you know this person? Do you really get that they have it? Do they get it? We'd like to think that we can focus on this no, but the able to do has to have equal weighting. And that's where the formative side can even just be early self-awareness. Oh, I didn't realize I don't communicate that well, especially in a technical topic. Or I really don't know my subject matter as much as I should, and I better before I step into a professional sphere where I'll be pretty well critiqued without any sort of formative thought process. So those moments, I think what we're trying to do is allow any of those experiences to be early on and to be scaled and interoperable so that the learners come out and say, wow, I'm so much further ahead than would have been if I just waited to take the test at the end and allow that collaborative relationship with the client to be able to flourish.
Right, exactly. So they get those safe practice opportunities and growth feedback along the way. Mark, from the Mursion perspective, same question. In what ways does Mursion offer safe practice and formative assessment opportunities with growth feedback?
So safety is actually very much at the heart of what we do. Whether you're a beginning teacher that has never stood in front of a group of kids, or a nurse that has never done rounds, or a leader who's never led a D&I meeting, the risk of failure is really high, and the consequences of failure are terrible. And if you use the education analogy, the last thing you want is your beginning teachers learning a pedagogical routine on the first period and hoping they get it right by the sixth period. So it's all about repetition in privacy. So we do private one-on-one simulated sessions where learners manifest the kind of error analysis, cognitive problems they might have, or behavioral or other issues that might, language differences, that teacher will never experience until they actually get in front of real kids. We give them a place to get multiple repetitions. Simulation is all about repetitive practice, and it's why we have flight simulators, right? You don't get the plane right the first time you take off. So you want to get lots of reps. We've done a ton of randomized control trials that show actually around a targeted behavior, you can actually change teacher practice with 4 to 6 simulations. On that practice, it shows up in simulation and the data shows up in live observation in the classroom. So repetition, privacy, and then we have in our model, we refer to it as the human in the loop. It is a blend of AI and real humans who animate the avatars behind the scenes. They actually lead people through a reflective process afterwards. We then give them video, and increasingly with the state of AI, we can actually tell people a lot about the way they came across. To what extent did you talk only to the boys in the class? To what extent did you raise your voice? Did you roll your eyes? How did you come across? How did they perceive you? There's a lot of data that we can give you that formatively shows how we all have had that moment where we see ourselves in video and we cringe because we sound funny or we look one side of the room or another. AI is increasingly able to pick up the degree to which I subtly interrupted people in ways. How much did I actually measurably give other kids talk time? What was my wait time in questioning? There's a whole lot of things you can do that we've built into our system right now that are super helpful for giving feedback.
Thank you, Mark. So now it is your turn. We are going to actually give you a competency. So we want you to think about the competency of communication. We're going to keep the definition pretty simple for today. So if you think about communication as the learner or the effective performer, right, can send and receive messages through verbal, nonverbal, and written forms by appropriately matching the modality of the message to the audience. So think like memo, text, email, call, or a meeting across individual, group, and presentation situations. How might you assess mastery? How might you measure mastery in that kind of a situation? So I know we don't have a lot of time to really, work in groups or anything like that right now, but I'd love some ideas from you all. If anyone is willing to share, what are thoughts on how you might measure mastery of the communication competency as defined?
And Tiffany has a rubric by which she'll be scoring you at the end of this, just for the record.
I had notes, but I don't. I have predetermined criteria up here.
The word authentic assessment came up earlier on, so I'd want let me make sure I get the learning target right. It's about matching the modality to what will work for the receiver.
For communication specifically? So that's what I think we would be asking you. How would you measure that?
I'd have to ask the receiver if they understood the message. Maybe ask them to recreate it.
Okay. Excellent example. Okay. Anybody else willing to share?
Well, it's a multifaceted construct, right? So, I mean, it's not as if there's one set of skills that constitutes communication. There's rather a lot there. If you were trying to validate all of them at once, what you really would have to break it down to a set of criteria. So the approach we've used with these complex constructs is what we call collections of evidence. And we use a variety of methods, and there's some flexibility to it. So two collections might not look exactly the same. They'd still represent mastery of a form of communication at some level, but they wouldn't represent exactly the same mastery of it. So you have to decide if that's sufficient to your definition in this context. But in public schools, for example, a lot of times communication really is allowed at that broad level to enhance some flexibility. And I think it probably should. I don't think we should be trying to get everyone to demonstrate communication at exactly the same level with all of these different modalities.
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, Laurie referenced that earlier, right? What is the level? What is the target level you're teaching to and delivering, right? For communication, for example. How do you break down written communication versus verbal, nonverbal? How do you teach that? Do you modularize? You know, there's all different kinds of things to consider there. And to your point, how do you measure whether you chose the right modality, right? Are you speaking to a supervisor? Are you speaking to a coworker, a direct report, a peer? And so there are different ways you can measure that. I'd love to hear from the panelists on their insights on how technology can develop and measure an individual's level of skill in communication as an example. So I don't know, who wants to start? I think Josh.
I think an example came to mind, especially being very specific about what and how things should be done. A lot of times we think of communication as public speaking. Hey, you can speak in front of an audience and you must be good. No, not at all. I mean, there are a lot of aspects to communication where the learner could very well be presented a complex topic, maybe someone monologuing for 3 or 4 minutes. And their job, their task is to take that complex concept and using active listening, summarize down into key points to the point where it's satisfactory and can be assessed. Right? Maybe they interact with a peer that gives them feedback that's time-coded right there in the moment. They say, oh, I totally botched that. Or they're assessed by someone who's an evaluator who really gets it and understands that, yes, they understand the complex concept and they're able to summarize it into a better communication pattern and allow the communication to flourish. So those types of things come down to design. They come down to specificity. They come down to, can we really get a target for what this looks like? And can it be demonstrated versus, well, they read a lot of material and they filled out some bubble sheets, and no, that's not good enough for that learner. And so that's the idea, at least.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Mark?
I completely agree that context really matters. I'll give 2 examples that we work in. In K-12, we work with teachers who've never been trained on how to have a parent-teacher conference. So think about the spectrum of parents who the hyper-engaged type A, suburban, like my family, and then the folks who just have felt excluded from the system, and you're drawing in. And your job as a teacher is to deliver whatever the news might be, but it is in applied behavioral psychology, our advisors talk about it as tracking. Am I tailoring the message to the audience in such a way that they are hearing it? And that skill is an adult skill that takes time to develop and practice, and it has to be sort of situationally relevant. Totally different sort of conversation is a small professional meeting where there's a microaggression, and I actually have to call out my colleague in front of their team. Or heaven forbid, they're in front of their team and their customer. Think about, so context of what it is that I have to do is truly, really, really important. And I think there are ways you measure and situate some of the same analytics I was talking about parsing how they come across, did they achieve the objective, tone of voice, expression, and engagement of the audience in such a way that you put them on that continuum of your rubric.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you make a great point, too, that we'd all agree the most important piece is transfer of learning, right, into the real world. So are we teaching to a point where they transfer that learning into the real world and can use it across contexts? One-on-one communication, communication in a team, communication with a superior versus a direct report versus a peer. All of that is so important. Gavin and Laurie, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, look, I think of things in a different way. Slightly in that I think about this question, except for I try to add in the idea of scale in there. Like, there's lots of ways to assess what we're talking about here in a one-on-one way with an expert. Kind of, you know, you can do that, but you can only do so many of those kind of interview-based things or examining or communicating back with someone. And I'm thinking about, like, how do we do this at a large scale? So, and some of those things are being able to kind of replicate some of these things in interactivity, in video, automating some of the analysis of that video. Are they making eye contact? What did they say? Dictation of that. Was it good kind of grammar? Or was it? Did it work? Did it talk about the salient points of what they were supposed to speak about? That kind of stuff. And that's just one example of speaking. Can you do the same thing in all the other things you said? Was the different examples, memos and texts and calls and meetings and whatever else. How do we look at that? And the technology is a great way, a great part to play in here around when you add scale to this. It's fine to do something one-on-one, but how do you do that at a large scale? Last year, you did millions and millions of users, and then you have this long-distance thing being brought in by COVID. That's kind of the other angle we kind of take on. And when you add in scale, what's practical to do? And then how many times can somebody do an assessment as well? If they're requiring a one-on-one with a tutor or with an examiner, they can do it kind of once, and then we're back to the idea of doing an assessment. When I learned French in school, I had one spoken examination at the end after learning it for 5 years. That was it, because it was always kind of practical. Can we bring that back in so I can speak every day, whether it's to a computer or to a peer or something that's that just kind of brings it more in the scale of how many times I can do that, and as an individual student, and then you bring in a whole population and try to replicate that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's an excellent point with scale, because we all wonder that, right? How do we scale this? How do we scale this? And I think just the representation of the tech tools up here are solutions for that. Laurie, did you want to add to that?
I would just say from an institutional perspective, it's really about the program design and how you're running your competency-based education program to figure out the solution. So for us, we're self-paced online modules, asynchronous time. So you have to keep all of that into account when you're looking at, what is the best technology to assess. So I think from an institutional perspective, just think about how you're running your program.
Right, that's a great point. And really getting at those levels of learning. What are we promising, right? What are we validating that we say our learners are leaving with? So today we've heard a lot about these tech solutions, right? I do want to open up just a few minutes for questions. I know we'd had a few hands up along the way, so I want to give to respect that. But when we talk about just CBE assessment practices, you heard a lot of those keywords today that would hallmark CBE assessments. We heard things like authentic assessment, formative assessment, summative assessment, intentional alignment, right, between competencies and all of those types of things. So I would love to refer you, before we get into questions, to, again, the CBEN quality framework. It has those 8 elements of quality to, what makes up a quality program, and how you might think about building and designing one. And then we did release in the fall the hallmark practices of CBE assessment, which is really kind of about how would you operationalize that, right? So you have element 4 of the quality framework, but then how do you actually build that and operationalize it? So 2 great resources you can find under the resources tab at cbenetwork.org. And so we have about 3 minutes left, a little less, if anyone has questions. Yep.
As far as the communication thought experiment, I would say, explain to me how to put a peanut butter sandwich together. And you can write me an essay, direct to an essay, like how to do it, do a video of it, do a silent movie with nothing said and everything written out. But to the point of competency-based approaches, my question is, when I was teaching and now as a principal, I really don't care that you have an A, a B, a C, a D, an E, a G, an F, an H. What do you know? What don't you know? That's more indicative of what I'm looking for. As a teacher, I think the previous session before this one, Charlotte was driving, and she was writing an assessment on the way to school, and she had to go to the mailbox. Teachers are limited with time.
Right.
And so myself, 10 years ago, there was something called KIA, and there were 10,000 questions on the production possibility frontier that an economics teacher can pull from. And when a kid doesn't get it, I got to give you feedback on why you're not getting AR conjugations or literary devices. But the more questions I can pull from that I don't have to write, I just have to authenticate. They are questions aligned to this standard. Kid, you're only as good as your last at bat. You struck out last time. That should make you want to hit again. So get back into the batter's box. Try point slow formula one more time. But teachers can't be writing assessments on the way to school because they'll be running in the mailboxes. So what resources are out there for practice and iterative approaches in that competency-based approach? We all know that there's summatives, the state test, the ACT, you name it, but I need practice.
So I'm going to refer to the panelists. I think a quick answer, just from my perspective, right, is that we always start with the end in mind. We know where we need to end up, right? But then you would intentionally design that journey on the front end so you would have those resources to pull from using subject matter experts. That's my quick hit, but does anyone else want to?
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. The formative assessments have to build building blocks to the summative. So if you're along the journey, then you're going to be successful at that end. But it has to be really intentional. And then to address the time part of faculty and instructors, your time is really front-loaded before you even start teaching that course. So you're building all of that before. And then once the course or competency starts, it's all teaching.
Yeah, what's the role of employers in helping to influence the evolution of these mastery assessments, because they're looking for something maybe different when the educator is thinking, so you're starting to see some traction there?
I can't help but start
Go
answering
ahead.
that question. I'll answer, zero, is that it's necessary to have your employers around the table when you're building your competency-based education programs, both looking at the assessments, the competency statements, and the learning journey. That's where you get the validity of your program and the relevancy, and they will help you make a better program.
And that is element 1, right?
Yes,
The
it
CBEN
is.
quality framework. So,
We believe
yeah, that's exactly right. Thank you all so much. We're out of time, but I know we'll probably stick around if you have further questions. Thank you.